Here's another thought. I'm going through the Brexit reports, mainstream media, and there's two narratives that I'm seeing. Number one, the more interesting one, is that it's a generational problem. Who was this? Maynard, something Maynard. He was a journalist and civil rights activist in the 1970s in America, black. And he wrote that there were 5 fault lines. And this is very important to understanding media, Alex. 5 fault lines. The first fault line is race, second class, then the other 3, gender, generation, and geography. So race, class, gender, generation, and geography. So how old you are and where you live. Those 5 fault lines, they're identified as fault lines because like a fault line in the earth, it's the source of an earthquake. It's the place where there is a fracture on the surface of the body of the planet, and it may cause turmoil when it slides. You get the idea. It's a genius analogy. And they're playing 2 things. They're playing the generation card really well, and they're also playing the geography card, which is very rare to see in mainstream media debate anymore. It's all about race, class, and gender, right? So check this out. It's the millennials and the younger generation that were fucked when the Brexit vote passed, because they were the ones that came out in full force, apparently, to vote vote for staying in, while the older generations, they stated for leaving the UN, the UE, the EU. I'll get my acronyms right someday. And that's generation, right? Now, what is the stereotype of the millennial generation? Well, they're whiners, aren't they? They're oversensitive, and they don't understand reality, right? They're used to getting what they want. And so here's that second generation, whining because they didn't get what they want. And then here comes another referendum, a second referendum. Oh, we're going to have that vote again because it didn't go the way they wanted the first time because, democracy. And that's a very interesting way to flip the narrative. And I think they flipped the narrative that way to hedge their bets. And I mean like the pro-Brexit people. The nationalist media, I think you would call it. Because what they're doing is they're taking the younger generation and they're saying, oh, they didn't get what they want, so now they want to do it again. And it's a very telling moment for everybody else what this generation that we have, the millennial generation, what they're like. It is exposing them for being the childish fools that they are. And not all of them, but quite a large section of them, because if this was 50 years ago, there would have been a vote and that would have been it. There have been no whining and screaming about how it didn't go my way. I want to do it again. Do-overs. No backsies. So I thought that was a very interesting dichotomy or comparison here, is that you have this older generation who voted to leave, and the younger generation that voted to stay in, and the older generation apparently had nothing to lose. And the younger generation, they apparently had everything to lose, and now that they didn't get what they wanted, they're complaining and crying, and they want a second vote. And that's the media narrative. And I think the media narrative is flipping a little bit. I think that the story is starting to change, and that maybe the mainstream media narrative is going to shift because the corporations, which only want money, are seeing that the real message, the real future is in more of a right-leaning, libertarian, conservative perspective.
I think there are a couple of things to bear in mind when considering the media's treatment of Brexit and other big issues like the elections coming up in America. On the Brexit matter, the young people, all the young people who I think are something of a vocal minority, the whiny millennials that are moaning and getting coverage, I don't know how representative they are. They certainly make it seem like all the millennials are whiny Europhiles, but there might be a large silent, or as I've heard it put better, silenced majority. Apparently, also there was very, very low voter turnout amongst the young people. There was extraordinarily high voter turnout amongst the old people in their 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s. They turned out a lot, but the younger people simply just didn't bother to go out voting. So that's one thing. As to the media's treatment of all of this, I think there are a couple of forces, some of them opposing. The one is the enormous left-wing bias, which really anyone who's even remotely in touch with objective reality can see in the mainstream media. And it's probably even truer of the mainstream media in the United Kingdom than in America. But of course, there is the very strong pull of the dollar, of the pound, of profit. Of course, mainstream media organizations get their money from the government. The BBC officially gets its money from the government. But even something like an ostensibly independent newspaper, I'm sure gets a lot of money through grants of some form or another. That would at the very least explain how some of them stay in business. And in America, the New York Times, a former newspaper, certainly doesn't stay in business on account of its newspaper sales. If it were simply relying on what it makes from its sales, you imagine it would have gone out of business a very long time ago. So my thinking is, if all free cheese, if all government money that's going into these organizations one way or another was suddenly cut, I think you would see the mainstream media groups swing very quickly to the right or just simply go out of business. And given the ideological impulse of the people who now are at the top of these organizations, I think the latter is more likely. I think they would rather see the organization just collapse in on itself rather than change. Or if there's still someone in mainstream newspapers, for example, who cares about profit, he might just find a way, or they might just find a way to depose the people who are ruining it for them from the top. So one way or another, the free market wins. Sometimes it takes a little while, sometimes it takes a few years, sometimes it takes a few decades, but ultimately the free market wins. And the free market, I believe, is consistently on the side of personal liberty and what we today recognize as traditional values in the West.